Namaste, friends, and welcome back to the podcast. This week I have guest, author, and speaker with me, Ann Tashi Slater, and she has recently written a book called Traveling in Bardo, The Art of Living in an Impermanent World. I am very excited for you to hear this conversation. We talk about this Tibetan Buddhism concept of Bardo. And what Bardo really speaks to is how life is impermanent. And not only life is impermanent, but everything within life is impermanent. There is constant change, and often we find ourselves in the in-between. And in midlife, this is particularly resonant, right? We are sometimes in between roles. We are sometimes in between relationships, in between bodies. Our bodies are changing. We're in between identities. These things are hard, right? When we are in the in-between, when we are realizing how impermanent things are because we're personally experiencing them, it often causes a lot of anxiety. It's very, very uncomfortable. So the idea of Bardo is this idea of becoming more accepting of the change, more comfortable with the transitions and the uncertainty, as so that we can show up and live more fully, and we can embrace the change, and not only embrace it, we can learn and grow from it. Bardo emphasizes that the more we accept the impermanence of life and of all the aspects of life, the happier that we will be. But that's not easy. So Anne and I, go deeply into how do we do that, right? How do I learn to get comfortable in the uncomfortable and fully embrace this fact that everything is impermanent and everything will change. And most of life, I would dare to almost say all of life, you are experiencing the in-between in some aspect of your life. And so how do we surrender to that, drop the resistance, and live more fully? Anne and I also talk about when we do that, when we learn how to drop resistance to this impermanence, that we have more time and energy to live in alignment, to do the things that really feel like they are meant for us, and how powerful that is. And I think maybe this conversation and this topic really spoke to me the way that it did, because this is the work that I do with midlife women. They're in transition. They're experiencing the impermanence of their jobs, their roles, their bodies, their identities, their minds. And it's very uncomfortable. And they're often in a lot of resistance to it. And it's preventing them from coming into alignment and living in a way that allows them to deeply engage in the things that they value and that are important to them, and that make them feel like their life is their own, that they're not living somebody else's life. So that's the work I do. So if you are in that season, if you are feeling like my life just does not reflect who I am, or my life doesn't reflect who I am, but I actually don't know who that is, then head over to my website, check out katiefarinas.com. You can see the different offerings that I have there, and you can book a free clarity call. We can discuss what coaching looks like and where you're at and what your needs are and how we can move forward and see if it's a good fit, because you deserve to live a life that's in alignment with your soul, with your essence, with who you are. You deserve to feel the joy and the peace and the passion that comes from doing that. So head over to my website, check it out, and enjoy this conversation with Anne. Okay, Anne, welcome to the show. I am so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's such a pleasure to be here.
I am really excited about the topic that we're about to cover. But before we get into that, would you just mind giving my listeners a brief overview of who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am an author living in Tokyo. I've been here for many years. I teach literature at university. And I had just published a new book called Traveling in Bardo, which is about how we move through uncertainty and change and transitions in life and find our way forward. So, and I grew up in California. And my family on my mother's side is Tibetan. And so that's part of my connection to this idea of Bardo, which we'll be talking about.
Okay. And so Bardo is a concept in Tibetan Buddhism, correct?
Exactly. And it
Okay.
means between state, right? And
Okay.
so any
Mhm.
kind of period where we are in like our ordinary reality is suspended, or it could be illness, it could be accident, it could be menopause, it could be the end of a relationship. It doesn't have to
Yeah.
be bad. It could be like having having a baby.
Right.
There are many different ways of understanding it.
Yeah. I just actually ironically read something earlier today that it was just very coincidental. It happened to be on the same day as this interview. A woman writing about, I feel like I'm always in between something, in between a job, in between a relationship, in between a parenting phase. And what I read it and I thought, well, isn't that the truth? Like our whole lives seem to me to be a series of in-betweens. And often that causes a lot of uncertainty and discomfort. We don't like the in-between, even though we spend so much time there. And wouldn't it be wise if we could learn to get comfortable in the in-between? And is that what Bardo is really about?
Yes and no. I think it's a very astute observation that, about always being in the between. And sometimes in the talks I give and so on, like the other day, somebody asked me, they said, well, are we ever done with Bardo? Like, can we just be done being in the between? And of course, as human beings, we want that because we don't like uncertainty and we don't like
Yeah.
transition usually. So we're like, we want to be like, okay, now we're done with that. But actually, we're never done with it. And
Yeah.
one of the definitions of Bardo actually is from birth to death. That's one of the betweens
Mm,
in the Tibetan Buddhist way of looking at it. So
okay.
it's like, there are betweens within the between, if you
Yeah.
will.
Yes.
And so we're always, we want certainty. It's just the way we're
Yeah.
wired as human beings, and then the universe is wired in a different way, right?
Right.
It's wired for
Yeah.
uncertainty, and so we are always in the between, some kind of between, whatever it may be.
Yeah. And I love, so the name of your book is called Traveling in Bardo, and I love that you chose the word traveling as the first word of the book because it just feels so perfect. Like this is the journey of our lives that we have this whole journey from birth to death, and depending on your beliefs, there's a before and after that. And so we're always traveling somewhere, and we're always traveling in this state of impermanence. And my dad growing up would always say, the only thing that I can tell you for certain is that everything changes. He used to say that all the time. And so it was sort of this similar concept that we can't really count on anything except change. Change is the thing that we can count on. But like you said, it's very uncomfortable. I think the human brain and body feels very uncomfortable without certainty. Um, and so we spend a lot of our time fighting or resisting this absolute, which is that everything is impermanent.
Exactly. And what's interesting too is that even if we are not happy in our situation, we often are loath to change it.
Yes.
And,
Yes,
and
that's
you,
so true.
you think it'd be like, oh gosh, I'm going to change this right now because it's not
Yeah.
working for me. But instead, we tend to cling to what we know.
Yeah.
And certainly, as your father sounds like he was a natural Buddhist. He's like,
Yeah. Well,
and
in some ways.
in that way, let's say, right?
Yes.
And that really that is the only thing that we can be sure of in a
Yeah.
very paradoxical kind of way, right?
Yeah.
And so, if and that the in from a Buddhist perspective, so we often think, it's famously, it's known that the Buddha said that all life is suffering. And
Mm.
so, the story of the Buddha is that he left his father's palace and went forth, to find a different kind of life and to search for enlightenment. And he saw, partly on his journey before he did that, he saw old age, sickness, and death. And we think often, well, that's the suffering. And it is, of
Mm.
course, in many ways, it causes us suffering. But from a Buddhist perspective, our greatest suffering comes from our resistance to change.
Mm.
And so it's not actually the change itself. And that really has helped me a lot as I've, as I go through my life and my journey, um,
Yeah.
is that whatever whatever kind of suffering we may feel from some change that's taking place, we compound it by resisting it or struggling
Yes.
against it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's so I'm a yoga teacher as well. And that's a lot of what we talk about in yoga philosophy is this resistance and how much suffering that we experience by not surrendering to what is, surrendering to the present moment exactly as it is. And it is very, very hard. And I started to think about, okay, so my show is primarily targeted at midlife women. So in midlife, there's a lot of change happening. There's change in our bodies, there's change in our relationships, our roles, our ways of just thinking about things, seeing, perceiving. And so that's our personal change that may be happening within our own little sphere of our lives. But then we have this greater change, like changes that are happening, particularly I'm in the United States, in the government, changes that are happening in our environment, the global environment. There are so many changes, and it gets people there's a lot of anxiety around it because we don't know what's going to happen. And I think that's one of the reasons why we resist it, even if we're, as you said, in a situation where we don't like our current situation, but we're still resisting the change because what does that change look like? What does that, what's going to happen on the other side? What does it mean for me, for the people I care about, for, life? And so does Bardo speak to that? Does it help people to get more comfortable with the uncertainty of what's on the other side of this impermanence?
It does. I'm thinking as you're talking, there are a lot of my Tibetan grandmother and I were very close, and she told me a lot of different stories, and these are interwoven in my book. And one of the stories she told me is that when she was in Tibet in the 1920s, they went to a funeral, like went a sky burial, and so the body was there on the ground, and the lamas were there saying the prayers from the Tibetan Book of the Dead to guide the dead person through another kind of bardo, which is from
Hmm.
death to rebirth, right, in the Tibetan
Hmm.
belief. And she said that the lama, the high lama there, could see that the dead person was trying to get back into his body. And that story always stayed with me because I thought it's such a great metaphor for what we
Yeah,
do in life,
yeah,
which is that when something's over, and if we can't get back to it, sometimes we can just stay with whatever it is, even if it's not working for us. But sometimes we cannot get back to it. So an example would be, like my children now are grown and gone, and so
hmm,
we have empty nesters, and I can't get back to those days,
yeah,
that we had together. Or if someone you love dies, then that
yeah,
life that you had with them is over, but we still cling to it. And
hmm,
so the idea in Bardo is that until we accept the reality of our situation, until we accept what is, we cannot move forward. And so if we
hmm,
take the idea, let's say in the death to rebirth journey, that the dead person cannot move forward to the next life. And again, metaphorically, that's very rich because the
hmm,
same thing for us, until we accept either the end of a relationship or the end of the life we knew in some way. Some years ago, I got very, very ill, and I couldn't go back to the life I had had before that,
hmm,
and I couldn't control it. But until I accepted the reality of my situation, I couldn't
yeah,
move forward to whatever was next for me. And so
yeah,
that idea, I think, is really helpful to us because we can say, well, if we stop struggling against whatever it is, it always reminds me of those snow globes. When you're a kid and you have that snow globe and you shake it
yeah,
up and there's all the snow so you can't see. And then the snow
yeah,
settles and you can see what's in there. And that's what
yeah,
it reminds me of, right? And so when we stop struggling and we let things settle, we can be like, okay, this is my situation.
yeah,
I don't like it. Maybe,
yeah,
I really don't like this. This is not working for me.
yeah.
But what that does, right? Because we're afraid to do that. Because, as I say, it's very human. But what that does is it allows us to think about what we want to do about that.
Yeah.
But if we're struggling against whatever it is, we're just lost in that struggle, and we're thinking like, why me? Why
Yeah.
now? Why not somebody else? Why did this have to happen to me? And so we feel
Yeah.
quite helpless rather than that, okay, I can make a choice here of what do I want to make a change? Do I not want to make a change? What do I
Yeah.
want to do about this?
Yeah. And I would imagine just understanding the concept may give you a little enough space because sometimes if we're in the struggle, we may not be recognizing how much we're resisting something, how much we're trying to live in a way of life that actually no longer exists for us. But having that knowledge of the concept, I would imagine gives you a little bit of space to see like, oh, look what I'm doing. I'm shaking up the snow globe. Maybe I need to take a step back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things that often we think is like, oh, that things happen to us. And they do. Of course,
Mhm.
things happen to us. But one of the really big ideas, and I'm sure you know this from the work you do, is about karma. And
Mhm.
karma we think of as being fate, often in the West, and
Mhm.
that it was my karma that this happened or
Mhm.
that happened. It was my karma not to get along with my kids, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But from a Buddhist point of view, karma means action,
Mhm.
and that what there's the thing of causality. So the things we do have a result or have a consequence. So
Mhm.
what you and I did yesterday, what we did last night, what we do this morning has a result. And of course,
Mhm.
there are things we can control and things we can't. Okay. And so sometimes people ask me, they're like, oh, what about, I live in Japan, and what about earthquakes? Like a terrible thing that happens, right? We can't
Mhm.
control that. But the agency we have, and this is one of the things I really love about the Bardo concepts, the agency we have is that we can decide in the face of whatever it is what we're
Mhm.
going to do about it. And action can be sort of intimidating because you think, oh gosh, you have to do some big thing. But it means body, speech, mind is the way we can think of it. So either we can do something physical, walk out of the house and go for a walk or leave or whatever. Speech, we can say something different from what we
Mhm.
normally say. Let's say you have a difficult relationship with your child, and you can be like, why do we keep getting into the same arguments? Or
Mhm.
with your partner, and you can say, okay, I'm going to say something different, or think something different. And
Mhm.
so the illness that I mentioned earlier, that was for me the action that I was able to take once I became more accepting of what had happened,
Mhm.
which was to change my perspective, right, on it. And that so
Mhm.
so it can be these really, it goes back to what you were saying about like there's all this upheaval in the world and we're like, oh gosh, what can we do, and this is so
Mhm.
difficult and painful. But in this very micro way, by like saying, okay, here, what actions am I going to take, in this moment, right, in this situation, we
Yeah.
can actually uh, be a lot happier.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And we talk about this too in yoga philosophy. I know there's a lot of overlapping concepts between the two, but thoughts, words, and actions, right? Those are the three things, which is what you're alluding to. Thoughts, words, and actions, and we get to choose those three things. There's a lot of things we don't get to choose, but we get to choose those three things. And those three things determine the experience of our lives, really. And I don't think, at least here in the West, I don't think there's enough emphasis placed on that concept that, you get to choose your thoughts, words, and actions in response to any situation. And listeners to my show will know that I also had a really difficult health situation that happened about 12 years ago. Hugely transformational for me. But it was only once I stopped resisting it, started accepting it, and then decided that I was going to choose thoughts, words, and actions that were going to create a life that I wanted to live. And so I really love that you brought up that point because I don't think that we talk about it enough.
I agree. I agree that we don't talk about it enough, and that we tend to just sort of tumble along, which
Yes.
again
Yes.
is, and we go from day to day, and we're all so busy. Everybody's so
Yeah.
busy, and you're like, and in a weird way, we can think, I'm too busy to think about all this, and
Yeah.
yet, and yet, we're only living in this moment,
Right.
in this present moment, not in the past, not in the future.
Yeah.
And if we can just go from day to day, and we're like, oh, but I don't feel that happy, or, okay, I'm going through midlife now, and a lot of things are changing, and but we feel weirdly too busy to pay attention to it, even though
Hmm.
actually for us there's nothing more important.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
it speaks also to another idea that I write about in my book, and that's very important in the Bardo concept, which is about distraction. And I remember when I went to my grandmother's funeral when she died, and I went to India, and the lamas are there, and the rituals, what they do is they sit next to her body and they read from the Tibetan Book of the Dead to guide her through, to the next life.
Hmm.
And the teachings are actually intended both for the living and for the dead, which I found very interesting when I first
Hmm.
heard it, and the idea is that we also can benefit
Hmm.
in the way you
That's
and I are
wise.
talking about now.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
As we go through from
Yeah.
birth to death. And one of the things that they keep saying, or they kept saying to her was, and if you look at the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it says this, it says, not to be distracted, right? It says, do not be
Mm.
distracted. And I remember thinking, why do they keep saying this, or what is this about?
Yeah.
And the idea, and again, this is very much, speaking to what you and I are talking about here. The idea is that when we're distracted, we're not able to actually pay attention to the reality of our situation. So either we're
Mm.
distracted by, again, wishing for the past, or speculating about the future, or regrets that we have, or all the
Mhm.
different things. And so, how you can go from, you get in your car maybe this afternoon and you do some errands, and you have no idea how you got from point A to point B.
Mhm. Yes.
You're like,
Yes.
you're like, oh, whoa, here I am at the
Yes.
post office.
Right.
You're like, right.
Yes.
And, and it's because physically our bodies were there, but our minds were completely somewhere else. And
Yeah.
that's what this is addressing.
Yeah.
And that if we devote time, if we actually, so often if we're preoccupied like that, and we're sort of
Hmm.
lost in these thoughts and reveries about things, we often feel unhappy, right? Or
Hmm.
dissatisfied from day to
Yeah.
day. And we're still, and we're living in a weird kind of all other reality, not the
Yeah.
one that we're actually in, right? And things we worry
Hmm.
about too. Like I write about the French philosopher Montaigne, and Montaigne, one of the things that he reportedly said was that the worst things in his life never happened to him. Right. And so,
Mm. Isn't that so true?
that's like, yeah, we were, well, what about this? Or what if that? Or what if that? Right. And
Yeah.
instead to
I-
be here in the present moment. And one of the things that if we that we can do to help us, be present, is to align what we do with what we care about. And that might sound really obvious, of course, but
Mhm.
actually it's not for a lot of us, because we end up spending our days doing the things that matter less to us,
Yeah.
right? And so whatever it may be, like if you want to write a book, or you want to spend more time with your child, or you want to start a volunteer organization or go running or whatever it may be, but we don't do it. And then it,
Mhm.
it reminds me of, how sometimes you're working on your computer and you can hear like this background, there's some stuff going on in the background, and I'm not very
Mhm.
techie, so I'm not sure what it is, but like some kind of background program. And that's what happens in our minds, is it's like it's a distraction, because we know we're not getting to what we care about the most. And
Yeah.
so it reminds me of those old cameras with the viewfinders, and where you had to line up, the images like this. And so if what we care about is aligned with our actions, then we can feel a lot less distracted.
Yeah.
And because we're not thinking about what we would rather be doing, or what we feel we should be doing in the larger scheme of things, because we know, even if it's like, taking half an hour in the morning to write in your journal,
Hmm.
or whatever, to call your mother, because you feel like you should, but you haven't, right? Spent some time with her. And that then, and this I think is a really interesting part of it too, is then even when we're doing things that we not care less about, but obviously wouldn't be our priority, like grocery shopping or going to the dentist, or, whatever it
Yeah.
may be, we can be more present in those moments as
Hmm.
well, or washing the
Hmm.
dishes or whatever. We can be
Yeah.
more present in those moments as well, because we know that we are also devoting time to what matters most to us, rather
Yeah.
than thinking, oh, otherwise we feel like we're always behind. We're
Yeah.
always behind. We can't catch up.
Yeah. It's so interesting because what you're making me think of is I have quite a few people in my life who have ADD. And if you know anything about ADD, generally speaking, people who have ADD have a very hard time focusing on anything that is not important to them. They can actually hyper focus on things that are very important to them, but if it's really they don't care, they're like a squirrel. They have a very hard time paying attention to it. And I often joke that in midlife, I've developed midlife ADD because I never experienced this before in my life, but I now have a very hard time focusing on things that I don't care that much about. And it seems like a problem, right? At first glance, you're like, well, that's a problem. But really, when you look deeper, it's actually not. It's a laser focusing of what's important to you and putting your attention on that and how much better you feel when you do that. And like you said, it doesn't have to be, we all have responsibilities and things that we have to do in our lives that maybe wouldn't be our preference. But when we do dedicate that time to the things and can be very, very present and focused with the things that are meaningful to us, it flows out into the rest of our life.
I really find that to be true. And to go back to Montaigne, he said something. He said, "When I dance, I dance." And I think
Hmm.
that's a wonderful mantra for us, as we could
Yeah.
think like, and again, that dancing could be like being at the post office or whatever, right?
Right,
But
right, right.
because, we do have to all
Mm.
do attend, as you say, to the responsibilities of our lives. And some of
Yeah.
them are really mundane and not terribly interesting. But again, it's that sort of granular, almost kind of granular sort of being in the moment and paying attention to whatever it is rather than thinking about other things and what we'd rather be doing. And so
Yeah.
that alignment and
Hmm.
it speaks to something else in Bardo, which is there's an idea about uh, like your authentic self, or your true self,
Hmm.
and in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, they talk about it as like as the person goes through Bardo, that you see these radiant lights, and those are the lights of your true self. And then down below, or you see these dull lights, and those the hell lights. They say those are the lights of our habitual propensities. And what that
Hmm.
means is it's the things that we habitually do that work against who we are
Yeah.
and our own happiness. And again,
Yeah.
that sounds like, why in the world would we ever do that? You think like, what? I'm
Yeah.
doing things that work against my happiness, but we do it all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
And so the idea is that we have that choice, going, and so we tend to be sort of, blinded by these radiant lights of our true nature. And one of the really uh, fundamental lessons, if you will, of Bardo is to understand that we are mortal, right? That we're
Hmm.
mortal, right? And so, because we live as if we're immortal, right? We're always like,
Yeah.
oh, I'll do that tomorrow, or I've always wanted to live
Yeah.
in Rome, but I'll move there next year, or I'll start writing my book, year after next, or whatever it is.
Right.
And when my grandmother died, they had, as I said, these ceremonies in the family altar room and for a few days, and then the body's taken to the cremation ground and put on
Hmm.
the pyre. And so we all went, all the family members. And one of the things that really surprised me is that we were expected to light the pyre because I thought
Oh,
we'd just be watching.
yeah.
And so I was handed, first it was my mother, and she lit it and took a circle around the pyre, and then it was me, and it was handed to me, and so I did it.
Hmm.
And as I say, it was really surprising to me, and I thought it would be kind of terrible, but it wasn't, and part of the reason for this, and it goes, and again with like the sky burial, for example, which is traditionally done in Tibet, where the body is actually there, on the ground, right in front of everybody. The idea is that it's a lesson for the living, a lesson in mortality and impermanence, but in a really good way. Because and my
Hmm.
grandmother used to say that. She said, "Oh, people say to me, isn't the sky burial kind of barbaric? And you're like chopping up the body, and then the vultures
Hmm.
like take away the pieces of it.
Hmm.
But actually, it's to remind you, no time, as she used to say, no time to waste.
Yeah.
She's like, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no time to waste, and that because we don't want to die with regrets, right?
Right.
And the Dalai Lama says, he says, you never know, we never know, we might die
Yeah.
tonight.
Yeah.
And so whatever matters to us, we should do now. And there's a story I tell in my book about, there's a wonderful writer, Gish Jen, a Chinese American writer, and I interviewed her and we were talking about these things. And she said that she graduated from college and she thought, oh, I got to do something. And so she thought, I'll just go to business school. So she went to Stanford Business School and it wasn't for her. She said right away she realized it wasn't for her. And what she kept doing was taking literature and creative writing classes. And at that time, she went to a funeral for the first time. And she said it suddenly hit her. She was like, oh my God, we're all going to die. And if I don't try to become a writer, she said, I just can't lie on my deathbed with regret of that
Yeah.
order. And so she dropped out of business school and went to the Iowa Writers Workshop. And she said her parents didn't talk to her for a year, after this, because they were very upset that she had done this. And she became, she
Mm.
became a very successful novelist, very successful writer. And so this idea is that whatever is right for us, whatever is right for us is what we should move towards, because we don't have all the time in the world. And
Yeah.
you see it, right? Often as people get older and they're like, oh, I wish I had done that. Or even,
Yeah.
I wish I had that talk with so and so, or I wish,
Hmm.
not like I wish I hadn't done such and such, because that kind of regret is often, kind of detrimental, but more just like things that we are important to us to do,
Yeah.
and that we put off, right? And so this idea of authenticity, and I think again this speaks to, in midlife, often we might find ourselves feeling kind of at sea, because where
Hmm.
maybe our role is parents, if we are parents, or our jobs or whatever our roles have been up to that time, are either over or changing.
Yeah.
And this again, it goes back to attention, that we can, if we pay attention and we are quiet, we let the snow globe settle, we think,
Yeah.
what do I care about? What matters to me? How do I want to spend my time? I have a lot of things to do today, but what part of that day can I take,
Yeah.
even if it's 20 minutes?
Hmm.
It's something that I really care about.
Yeah. How do you, as you're talking about this concept and saying how, we don't know if we have another day and we should really be doing the things that we care about, how do we balance that, this idea of impermanence and that, things are going to change and we're not going to be here forever, with also, the word dharma is coming to mind. I don't know if it's used the same in Tibetan Buddhism as it is in yoga philosophy, but it's kind of this concept of this, our duty, our the duties that we carry in life, and those come on many different levels and in many different ways. But I've always struggled with this concept of honoring our duties while also honoring ourselves, because there's a sacred duty to self as well. As I said, there's levels of dharma. And sometimes it feels as though those duties are in conflict with one another. So how can people learn to balance these things?
It's a great question. And, I think it's again, I return, again to this idea of attention, because I think it's really like we have to, and even when we're really, really busy, we can sort of create space in our minds, right?
Hmm.
Create space in our minds where we can just give ourselves a feeling of spaciousness and thinking, okay, well, even on a daily basis, let's say today, today's going to be a really busy day, and thinking, not just like plunging into it and hoping to make it through,
Yeah.
but it's like,
White knuckling.
right? It's like, and then collapsing into bed at the end of the
Yeah.
day. But even taking, again, a few minutes for whatever, whether you meditate or whether it means going for a walk or just having a cup of coffee, and thinking for a minute, like, what is this day going to look like? And
Mhm.
how am I going to, and it's it's really busy. How am I going to take a few minutes to spend some time on something that, do I want to, I can see that something's going on with my daughter, so let me suggest that she and I take a walk or
Hmm.
whatever it might be.
Right.
And what's interesting about that, I mean, I have found this, to use a sort of analogy as a writer, that this has helped me a lot. So for example, let's say on a given day or a given week, I'm really, we're all really busy. I'm really busy. And I'll look ahead and I'll think, okay, what are the times I'm going to have either during this day today or during this week to write? And so on one day, maybe I'll have 3 hours, and another day I can see that's not going to happen at all. And
Mm.
I think, well, I'm going to have like 35 minutes, right?
Yeah.
But, but then I have those 35 minutes. But if I don't look ahead to the day or to the week, whatever it may be, I won't use them in that way.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So maybe those 35 minutes, I'll like look at Facebook or I'll, read,
Yeah.
which is great. But I mean, I won't actually, again, and it goes back to that idea of devoting time to what matters to us. So yeah, what you're talking about with the Dharma and responsibilities, and we all
Yeah.
have that, but
Hmm.
a lot of it, I think, is a kind of almost a planning thing. I mean, is like,
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
that and it doesn't mean that we need to be so tightly scheduled. We could be like, actually, Thursday afternoon from 1 to 3, I'm going to do nothing.
Right.
If that's what you want,
Yeah.
I'm going to be off the grid. I'm going to be out with my dog, and I'm not going to be on, texting or emailing or, on the phone. And I'm going to take some time for myself, right?
Yeah.
Or um, whatever it may be. And so I find a lot of it is really like paying attention to, again, what I care about, perhaps balanced against what I maybe care less about but have to do.
Right.
Right?
Right. Yes.
we, all, we,
We
we
all
all
have
have
those
we all
things.
have those
Yes.
things. We all have those things.
Yes.
Exactly. Right. You're like, but
Yes.
again, that, just be like, okay. And so it's a kind of a, a a
Hmm.
valuing of ourselves, and a valuing of because we tend to do for others. That's
Hmm.
our focus, and especially if we're, again, parents or teachers or whatever
Yeah.
it may be, um, or healthcare worker. There's so many different fields where
Hmm.
this is true, and um, but that to think first, and I think especially for women often, or for
Hmm.
girls, is that we're told that that's selfish,
Yeah.
right? So it's selfish to be thinking first, well, what do I want? Or what works for me? Does this work
Hmm.
for me? Does this not work for me? Certainly when I was growing up, that was like a selfish thing to think, a
Hmm.
selfish thing to say, or selfish thing to think as a girl. It's like, well, who do you think you are? Like,
Yeah.
like the right, like,
Yes.
but I think it's really one of the most important things that we can always ask ourselves is like, does this work for me?
Yeah.
And not in any kind of judgmental way. It doesn't matter if it works for so and so or so and so, but does it work for me? Is this aligned with who I am? And
Hmm.
I find that that's a really wonderful way of evaluating what we're going to do or not do, or again, how we spend our time,
Yeah.
right? And so we think, well, is this does this resonate with who I am and what I care about? And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, then it wouldn't probably be the way we'd want to spend our time.
Yeah, those are the things that need to, generally speaking, fall off the list, which creates more space to actually do the things that are aligned for you and do feel deeply resonant with who you are. And I think that's a balance too, that is sometimes difficult to walk the line because there are some times in life where something doesn't feel quite, you would prefer not to be doing it, but yet on a deeper level, you know it's the right thing to do. And so, yeah, we always have to be use discernment to come back to that skill of discernment of what stays and what doesn't, what feels really resonant, what doesn't and can go, or maybe what doesn't, but for some deeper meaning or reason, we still might engage in doing that thing.
Yeah, yeah. And we, again, particularly as women and growing up as girls, we worry too much about what other people think of us.
Hmm.
And we tend to evaluate things thinking like, what will so and so think, or what will, that it's. I remember another person I interviewed was Elizabeth Gilbert, and she was saying that there's some study that shows that, like, when people retreat to a cave or up to the top of a mountain and they're there for 2 years meditating or whatever, the very last thing to go is, what are other people thinking of me? And
Wow.
isn't that
Wow.
amazing? Like,
Yes.
that's the very last thing, right? And and um and that we tend to use that as our yardstick, or our way of, assessing whether we're going to do something or not. So coming from the outside in, rather than, I think of it as the inside out, right? It's an
Hmm.
inside out, like, it doesn't matter what so and so thinks or so and so thinks, but for me, what
Yeah.
do I think? And does
Right.
this work? Does this work for me? And interestingly, as far as I know, human beings are the only animals who can not be themselves. Do you know what I mean? So, like, my dog
Hmm.
is not ever not a dog who
Yes.
he is.
Yes. Yes.
he's 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 always a mini schnauzer. And he's not,
Yes.
and he's not like, how did I end up being a cat, when I'm really a dog, or whatever it might
Right.
be. But you know how we can be like, oh, how did I end up in this job when this isn't at all
Yes.
right for me, right? Or
Yeah.
how did I end up in this relationship, or how, and so we do things that actually are not who we are, right? Or
Yeah.
we have a public persona, often a
Hmm.
public persona that is not aligned with who we are. And so I think, again, that alignment, bringing those things into alignment, is a
Yeah.
really fundamental part of being able to feel, again, satisfied and feel happy. And
Hmm.
the Dalai Lama, he says that fundamentally, everyone wants to be happy. And that sounds very simple in a way, and it's very profound, I
Hmm.
think, because it's true. If you
Yeah.
think about, like, that's however we may define it, or however we may, try to live in that way, that is what we're looking for,
Yeah.
right? Is to feel uh, happy, to feel satisfied, to feel that we are living in a ethical and aligned way,
Yeah.
for who we are.
Yeah. Absolutely. And we are ultimately the ones that get in the way of doing that. I talk about a lot on this show. We talk about coming into alignment. That's what I do. I help women to come into alignment in their lives. And oftentimes they show up feeling really defeated, feeling like they've done something wrong, that it's their fault. There's a lot of like guilt, shame, negative thoughts about themselves swirling around in their minds. And what I hope to help them understand is that we kind of picked up all this stuff along the way. We came into this world knowing who we were. You don't need to change anything about yourself. You just need to let go of all that stuff that actually isn't you. And then the real you is able to emerge. You're just, polishing away all the stuff that culture gave you, or your parents gave you, or your teachers gave you. And somehow we absorb it because we do have this fundamental desire to be liked, to feel safe, to feel part of the tribe, to feel all those things. And so we have contorted ourselves into shapes that are we don't belong in, to feel those things. And I think at some point, and midlife is a great example for many people, they finally say, I can't do it anymore. Like I can't hold this shape anymore. I can't carry all this stuff that isn't mine anymore. I'm so tired. I have to put it down. And when they put it down is when the real essence of who they are can shine through. Um,
There's a wonderful concept, which I'm sure you're familiar with, in Buddhism, where, it can sound so daunting, because in a way it's easy to go, oh, be your real self. And you're like, yeah, of course, like, why
mhm.
wouldn't I? Right. And so,
Yeah,
but it's actually really can feel incredibly difficult or
yeah,
impossible.
yeah.
But from a Buddhist perspective, our, whatever you want to call it, our true self, or our authentic self, is always there, right? And so, in a
Hmm.
sense, we don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
And it's compared to the blue sky. And you know how when you
Hmm.
when you take off in an airplane on a cloudy day, and you take off, and you go above the clouds and there's the sky. And so I always think of that, and there's
Yeah.
always that blue sky there. And
Yeah.
our true nature is always there, and so in a
Hmm.
sense, we don't have to go out and find it.
Yes. Yes.
Right?
No,
It's not like, I know it's out there somewhere, like,
yes.
but we already have it. We already
Yeah.
have it.
Yeah, I always think about the images tend to pop into my mind, but those I think they're Russian stacking dolls. There's like the big doll and you open it up and then there's another one, you open up and there's another one. And I always think of it like that. It's like you're in there. You just have all this encasement around you that has to be moved out of the way. It just has to be pushed to the side. You've always been there. And you don't have to, like as you said, go out looking for something or finding something or trying to be something. You don't have to try to be anything. You just have to learn to allow yourself to be who you are, which,
Mhm.
as you said, it's not always easy. In fact, it's
Yeah.
quite hard for most people.
Yeah, it can be very difficult, and again, in very micro ways. Another writer who I talk about in my book is the wonderful Melissa Febos, and she was talking about like how she has been able to come more into her own, like true nature. And she was saying that, of course, we were talking about how growing up as girls, you have all these
Hmm.
scripts, you're supposed to follow and look nice, be pretty, please other people, so on and so forth.
Hmm.
And she was talking about this sort of micro way of that she had been able to make changes. Because again, often we think, well, we have to make these sweeping changes, but often just
Yeah.
these little small things have really big reverberations or
Yeah.
consequences. And so one of the things she did is she realized, how sometimes like someone wants to hug you and you don't want them to hug you,
Hmm.
right? But a lot of us are not going to say that because it
Right.
feels rude.
Yeah.
Even though
Yes.
actually
Yes.
the rudeness is that they're want to hug you when you don't want them to
Yes.
hug you, right? And we feel like, oh no, we can't say no, don't. So she
Right.
said what she started doing was to think when someone said let's hug, she gave herself a beat and a pause, and she would think for a minute. She goes, do I actually want to do this or not? And she said often the answer was no. And so
Right.
she would say no. And she said, nobody died, the world didn't end. It's like,
Yes.
because you think you're gonna spontaneously combust or something, right?
Yes.
And that in fact, but that has huge reverberations of trying to say, actually, no, doesn't feel right for me, or that doesn't work for me, rather than this
Yeah.
other person just doing it because it feels right to them. They want to do
Right.
it, right? And so
Yeah.
her being able to start setting those boundaries was
Hmm.
a very, very powerful, and again, I think of it as like a micro action with macro results,
Yeah.
huge, because then it starts extending into other areas of your life,
Hmm.
where you take similar actions. And it goes back to what we were talking about, body, speech, and mind. That
Yeah.
would be an action of all three.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
right,
Yeah.
say something different, think something different, and
Yeah.
physically do something different, which was to
Yeah.
stand back for a minute and say, let me see, do I really want to do this?
Yeah.
And so and I think too, going back to this idea of, for example, lighting the funeral pyre at my grandmother's funeral, cremation, that at the end of the day, we're going to breathe in, we're going to breathe out, and
Hmm.
that's going to be it. And a lot of times you see people at the end of their lives, whenever it may be like, oh, why did I care so much about what other people
What?
thought?
Hmm.
Or why did I care so
Yeah.
much about this? Or why did I care so much about that? And of course, it's normal, day to day, we can't live in that space. We're just living our day to day lives. But in a larger frame, it's true, these things that I think if we really would feel unhappy, if we reach the end of our lives thinking that we've spent our time living a life that wasn't not the life that was ours to live.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I do this little exercise with my clients where I ask them to imagine themselves as their, 85, 90-year-old self who is surrounded by their family, but on their deathbed, they know, their time is coming. They're about to enter their next phase of Bardo, and which I've never used that term before, but I will now. And what would they want? What would they want to know that they had said, done? create it? What would they want their family members when their family members were speaking about them to be saying about them as the truths of who they are? And it's a powerful exercise when you think about it. It really pans you out, because I think in that day to day of just living that and all of our responsibilities, we tend to hyper focus in, the aperture really closes in. And I think it's so useful to take some time in our lives to pan out and try to see things from a bigger picture and get more focus. Everything that's really important actually starts to come into focus when we can do that.
I agree. I agree. And we really, it, interestingly, it slows things down, right? Because that's what
Hmm.
we always want is we always want more time, right? We think,
Yeah.
oh, and the days are rushing by and the years are rushing by. And doing that actually seems to slow time down, even though it's the same
Yeah.
24 hours, right?
Yeah.
And again, it's because we feel more, again, to go back to this idea of alignment, we
Yeah.
feel more aligned and focused
Yeah.
on what we care about, and we're not going to be filled with regret,
Yeah.
when
Yes.
whenever our last day comes.
Yeah, trying to use whatever precious time we have wisely, using it to the best of our ability.
Right. And
Um,
of course, we can't always, sorry,
no good, no good.
we can't always do that. And I think that's another really helpful thing is
Yeah.
to be, I mean, the way I think of it is like to be loving towards ourselves, because
Mhm.
we do it for other people. And the Buddha said, to act towards ourselves as we would of a mother towards her child, with that sort of
Mhm.
loving and compassion, like,
Yeah.
and so if you quote unquote, waste an afternoon or something doesn't go the way you wanted it to. And then we'd be like, oh gosh, why did I do that? I'm like, my time is limited. And, but rather to be, maybe we did waste an afternoon
Yeah.
or, or wasted a week or the vacation didn't go well, things.
Yeah.
But again, that circles back to what is. Do you know what I mean? So
Right.
it
Right.
circles back to accepting what is and be like, you know what? That's how that went.
Yeah.
And or and I had different hopes for it and it didn't go that way, or I could have done things a little better, and that's okay. So
Yeah.
we need to also loosen the leash on
Yes,
ourselves,
yes. I
right?
mean, not put so much pressure on. Yes,
Right,
I totally
right.
agree with you because the pendulum can swing too far to the other side, and then that becomes an unhealthy pattern in itself. It, I should probably ask you this at the top of the hour, but it's okay. I'm asking you now. Of all of the concepts, I'm sure there are a lot of beautiful concepts in Tibetan Buddhism. What made you choose this concept? Why did you feel so passionate about this particular topic to write a whole book about it?
There are a couple of different reasons, and one is that the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which actually, according to legend, was composed in the 8th century and didn't come to the West until 1927, and it was published in English translation in 1927 by Oxford University Press. And my great grandfather, my Tibetan great grandfather, helped to make that possible. So
Oh, wow.
so I have a very, very close family connection to it, and
Yeah.
the he was my great grandfather was in Darjeeling, and the editor came to Darjeeling and was looking for a translator, and my grandfather introduced them, and so and I became aware of this story, and he also was a devout Buddhist and very familiar, with the
Hmm.
teachings, and also because I myself, and of course, this is something I've been involved in and learning about and writing about for many years. Subconsciously, I think I felt that I couldn't have called it Bardo because I didn't know, when I was younger, but I felt very much in a kind of Bardo state, when I was growing up and growing up Tibetan American
Hmm.
I used to live in New Jersey and then we moved to California. And at the time when I was growing up, it's very different from how it is now. There were just no other Asian Americans. It was
Hmm.
just me and my three, siblings.
Yeah.
And so I felt and my mother had come to the States when she was 19 to study medicine and become a doctor. And she very much wanted us to fit in. And children, of course, want to fit in. And so she didn't teach us anything about Buddhism or particularly about the Tibetan side of the family.
Mm.
And so that suited me fine because I didn't want to be doing Buddhist rituals while everyone else was doing Easter egg hunts.
Right.
So that part was fine. But I had this really weird feeling of betweenness because I felt like I was between these cultures, of like, because my
Yeah.
father was American, my mother was Tibetan. And
Yeah.
then there was this part that I didn't really know anything about. And so after college is when I went back to Darjeeling. I hadn't been there since I was 3 and started learning a lot more about this and getting to know my grandmother. And so I think that subconsciously I was drawn to it as well, partly because of the family connection and partly because of my own experience, my own feelings of betweenness and trying to, kind of living in this liminality, like,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
trying to find my way forward. And I really understood more and more how the Bardo concept or ideas are very much about, because people are like, oh, why would you want to study about death? And like, why think about death during the time that we have on the planet, that we're
Hmm.
alive? But that it's actually very much about possibility. And I love that because the idea is that there's nothing, it's like what your father said, change is the only thing we can be sure of.
Hmm.
And there's nothing we can do about that. Everything
Yeah.
changes, everything ends, including us.
Yeah.
But within that, there's tremendous possibility for insight and growth and new ways of living and new paths forward. And I think that I really sensed that.
Yeah.
I sensed that when I
Mm.
was doing this, and then as I learned more and more, it took me a long time to to understand it and to understand
Yeah.
why it resonated with me, and also why this felt like a very important thing for me to understand and
Yeah.
to write about.
Yeah. Well, that's beautiful. And what a way to honor your family. I mean, how beautiful. It's really lovely. Thank you for
Yeah,
sharing that
I
story.
love too, because as I said, it was published in 1927. So
Yeah.
actually, next year is the 100th anniversary of that. And so I really
Wow.
have this
Yeah.
feeling of carrying forward my great grandfather's work, because this
Yeah.
was something that he actually was he was a monk for quite well, some time when he was young in
Okay.
a monastery in the Darjeeling area. And these teachings were very important to him. And I know he
Yeah.
would be really happy to,
Yes. Oh, I'm sure he is very proud wherever he is.
whichever life he's in now. That's right.
Yes. And to think too, I didn't want to interrupt you when you were speaking before, but when you were talking about this book, which you just told me was written when in the eighth,
8th century.
8th century, and they talked about distraction and how pertinent that is to our current everyday lives. I mean, that's really probably one of the biggest struggles we currently face in this, time and era that we're currently living in. And they were talking about it back in the 8th century. That just blows my mind.
It's incredible, isn't it? Because you
Yeah.
think, really, like,
Like,
and
what were
these
you
teachers are
distracted by back then?
and, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead actually says, I couldn't believe when I read this, when I started reading it, is it says that when we die, okay, and let's take that either literally or metaphorically, that when we die, that we're in denial. And it doesn't use the word denial. What it says is that the dead person, and my grandmother used to say this too, they hover around. They hover
Mhm.
around after they're dead. And my grandmother said, they hover around the altar room, and they're like looking at everyone there who's so sad, and they're like, how come you guys are so sad? What's going on? I'm right over here. And for about 4 or 4.5 days, the book says, we do this because and it goes back to what I said about the dead person trying to get back into his body,
Yeah.
and that we don't want to accept. We don't want to accept what's happened. But until we
Yeah.
do, we can't move forward. And going
Yeah.
back to what you were just saying, like, this was the idea in the 8th century that was
Yeah.
that was in the book, and it's so pertinent to our lives
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I guess it just speaks to the human nature and that as much as we have changed and evolved as human beings, our basic nature has remained the same. And um, it's the struggles we faced in the 8th century are the same struggles that we're facing today on this human journey.
And if you look at the news, look at your social media feed, look at interviews with people, look at things people are thinking about, and it's so often coming back to this, to impermanence, whatever
Yeah.
it may be, either losing someone they love or a big life transition. And one of the ways I write about it in the book and that I think about it is as voluntary bardos and involuntary bardos. And
Mm.
so a voluntary bardo would be something like, uh, once when I was in Darjeeling and I was doing research for a book, I was going to interview these lamas, and I went at the appointed time, and the guy who was introducing us said, "Oh, sorry, they're not here." And I said, "Well, that's okay. I'll wait." He says, "Well, they've gone to the cave." And I said, "Well, that's, yeah, I have time. I'll wait." And he said, and it was the fall, right? And he goes, "Well, they're going to be there till spring." Right? I said, "No, I guess I'm not waiting." And so what happened, Darjeeling, of course, is in the Himalayas, very far north, and it's very cold in the wintertime. And they retreat. They go on retreat to the south of India into a cave in order to meditate and gain deeper insight and so on and so forth. And that would be an example of a voluntary bardo where you
Mhm.
retreat, literal, like into a cave, or maybe you go away for a little while or whatever it may
Mhm.
be. Involuntary would be something like illness,
Mhm.
an accident, losing someone we love.
Mhm.
And both of those are times that are filled with possibility, is the Bardo idea. So whether it's voluntary or involuntary, voluntary is
Mhm.
maybe easier to see because we can say, obviously, for example, if you're a monk retreating to a cave or whatever the analogy may be for us,
Yeah.
where we're opening our minds to seeing new things. And then if it's involuntary, if we can, the more we can get to a place of acceptance of what's happened, um, the more possibility there is for us to see new things or to have
Mm.
new insight. And so it could, for example, when I was ill, and it was something called endocarditis, which is this
Oh,
terrible, it's
I,
a
yeah.
infection of your heart lining, yeah.
Mhm.
And so it looked like I wasn't going to make it,
Mm.
um, and I remember thinking at that time and afterwards, and I thought, well, in the Bardo teachings, they say that in Bardo we're trying to regain a lost harmony. And I always thought that meant that we were trying to get back our old life, the life that we had. And certainly that was my
Mm.
experience in the beginning of my time in the hospital, was wishing I could get back to this beautiful life,
Mhm.
that I had with my husband and children and my career and
Mhm.
so on. And what I realized after I recovered, and I'd been out for a little while, and is that harmony is not actually that. That's not what it's talking about. And what it is it's the harmony we lose when we forget that impermanence is the
Mm.
basic fact of life. That's the
Yeah.
piece. And that came to me very, what should we say, hard earned through this
Yes.
involuntary
Instead Bardo,
bardo.
yes.
Right.
Yes.
But it's interesting, right? And so
Yeah.
the one of the ideas of in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is considered what's called a treasure teaching in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And uh, the idea is that these treasure teachings, there were many, this is one of them,
Mhm.
were hidden. Let's say this one was hidden in the 8th century to be found by later generations when they were needed or when they were most needed.
Mm.
And one of the really evocative things about this is that they were hidden, let's say, in caves or in lakes, in trees. They also say they were hidden in the sky, and they were hidden in dreams, and they were hidden in the mind stream.
Mm.
And I love that idea because I think that
Yeah.
these things often, if we think like, what is inside you? What do you know? What do you not know? What
Yeah.
wisdom is available to us? That
Yeah.
if we have the right perspective, if we are open to it, that we can discover new insights
Yeah.
within us in a, like thinking of that in a metaphorical way.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And I mean,
Yeah.
I've had experience with that. So that really resonates where things just come and you feel like they came from somewhere else. You know, that it's an insight that arrives that feels like it was dropped into you in some way, but it didn't actually come as it's not from your own mind, but from something outside of you that gifted you this knowledge or this wisdom. And it's like a little treasure
Yeah,
when
it's
that
really
happens.
interesting, right? And so
Yeah.
so I think of it as our inner landscape. It's our
Mhm.
inner geography, and somewhere in our inner geography are these things that these insights or wisdom that are available to us. But if we're screaming and railing against what is, they're a lot less available to us
Yes.
because
Yes.
because we're like,
Yes.
all of our attention and energy is taken up
Yes.
with, wishing that what is was not.
Yes. And it's very noisy when in that resistance, there's a lot of noise and those insights, those gifts arrive in the quiet. You really have to get still and you have to get quiet for them to show up. So if you're raging against life and what is, whether that be internally or externally, it's just too noisy for things like that to show up.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. This was fascinating. I could keep you on forever asking you more and more questions, but I don't want to hold you up. But thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I'm going to put the link to the book in the show notes, as well as any of the other links that you sent me so people can reach out to you or find you in any way that you're out there in the world.
Wonderful, wonderful. And let me know if there's anything I can send you or you need any other information.
Okay,
But yeah,
awesome.
it's been such a pleasure. Yeah, thank
Oh,
you so
it's
much.
been so
Yeah,
great. I'm so glad that you found my show and that you reached out to come on because this was really
great,
fun.
great. Thank you, Katie.